Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event. I am Dr. Jacob Renneker, the Scholar in Residence and Director of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation, and the host for this Come Follow Me Interfaith Conversation series. For our conversation this evening, we're going to talk about the sacrifice of Isaac from a Jewish perspective, and just kind of as a logistical housekeeping issue. You will be able to submit your own questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So you'll just click there, and you'll also have the opportunity, if you go there, to vote for questions that other people have that you would also like to see answered. So we will be getting to those at about 20 minutes till the top of the next hour. And so you'll have the opportunity to do that there. Please only include questions rather than comments there, so it'll be easier for us to get to and sort through those when the time comes. And yeah, so you can ask those questions not just toward the end of our conversation here, but at any point during the event. So please ask questions as they come to you. And the last piece of housekeeping here, you can find video replays of this and all of our other events along with the podcast recordings, which we're just starting to make those available at www.widtsoefoundation.org. So without any further ado, our guest tonight is Rabbi Mark Diamond. Rabbi Diamond is a senior lecturer in Jewish studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches core curriculum courses on Jewish thought and interfaith relations. He also teaches graduate courses in practical rabbinics at the Academy for Jewish Religion, California. And interfaith conversation is something that Rabbi Diamond is very familiar with and experienced in. So in interfaith and ecumenical dialogue have been highlights of Rabbi Diamond's career as a pulpit rabbi, a nonprofit executive, and an academic. So he's done a little bit of everything here. He's the former executive vice president of the Board of Rabbis of Southern California and a past president of the Los Angeles Council of Religious Leaders. He's the co-editor of an excellent volume called Understanding Covenants and Communities, Jews and Latter-day Saints in Dialogue, which is available from the Religious Studies Center at Brigham Young University. So you can get copies of that there. And it's co-published by the Central Conference of American Rabbis. So, Mark, is that the very first co-publication between a Latter-day Saint and Jewish press to your knowledge?
Absolutely, we're very proud of that fact.
Yeah, it really is a great volume. He's also the co-author of a forthcoming volume that we hope to get everyone more information on soon, called Understanding Our Jewish Neighbors, which is a project that the John A. Widtsoe Foundation has organized, and Rabbi Diamond has done some great work there. I'm really excited to get that material out to everyone to help Latter-day Saints better understand their Jewish neighbors. So that being said, I'd like to welcome Rabbi Diamond here. And first, we would love to hear some just general opening thoughts on Genesis 22, sacrifice of Isaac in the Jewish tradition.
Thank you, Dr. Renneker. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to you and the Widtsoe Foundation for sponsoring the series. Special thanks to you for being part of our Jewish Latter-day Saint Academic Dialogue Project. It's very exciting. As you mentioned, we're so pleased that the book came out, the first joint publication of a Jewish and Latter-day Saint press, and hopefully more to follow. So it's very good to be with you. Thanks to everyone who's joined us on the webinar this evening. Wow, Genesis chapter 22, the sacrifice, or technically in Hebrew, the binding of Isaac, known in Hebrew as the Akedah, is an awesome narrative. And I use awesome in two ways. Awesome in the way that many people, especially young people, use the adjective and adverb today, which means something that is amazing and impressive, which it is. But the traditional meaning of awesome, as you well know, is something that inspires awe or dread, apprehension or fear. And the Akedah is all this and much, much more. It is a narrative, this Genesis chapter 22 is a narrative that is read twice a year in synagogue, once each fall as part of the regular Sabbath or Shabbat lectionary cycle that begins with the opening words of Genesis and concludes a year later with the closing words of the book of Deuteronomy. The entire Torah is read traditionally in a year. But this particular passage, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is the special Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. It's the second day of the festival, and congregations that observe 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, that's when this passage is read. And it is the only Torah reading in congregations that observe 1 day of the holiday. So why was this section of the Bible chosen as the scriptural passage for Rosh Hashanah, one of the most sacred days of the Jewish calendar? And I think this question brings us to Jewish interpretations and views of this awesome story. And I want to stress here, interpretations or views. Many people on here tonight know that we have that wonderful adage, 2 Jewish people, 3 opinions. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles and books on the Akedah, hundreds and hundreds of Jewish commentaries on the binding of Isaac, not even counting the vast number of published and unpublished rabbis' homilies, sermons on the Akedah. There's even a website called the Akedah Project. Some of your viewers may want to, people may want to tune in. It is a website called the Akedah Project. It's sponsored by a group called Judaism Unbound. It has 39 video presentations, commentaries on the Akedah. Dr. Renneker, we could have a semester-long university course focusing exclusively on the binding of Isaac, and we would barely scratch the surface of what's been written about this compelling narrative. So this evening, and in our limited time, I'll share just selected highlights of Jewish interpretations, again, plural, interpretations of the Akedah. This is a narrative that scholars like to say is fraught with background, invites us to ask a series of questions. Among the questions are the following. Why did God test Abraham in such a dramatic fashion? Doesn't God know all things? Why does God have to put Abraham to the test? And what kind of God is this anyway? How can a loving, compassionate God be portrayed as commanding a father to sacrifice his son? Next, why did Abraham not protest God's command to sacrifice his son as he did? You recall in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham bargains with God, right? Here, he apparently doesn't say anything. Or perhaps he did protest, and we just don't have a record of that in the Torah. Next, how old was Isaac during this episode? According to rabbinic tradition, he was 37 years old. My God, why didn't he protest when Abraham bound him to the altar? He's a 37-year-old young man. Didn't he say anything? Didn't he protest? Didn't he object in any way? That seems very odd. Where was Sarah in all this? Was Sarah aware of her husband's plans to sacrifice their son in loyalty to God? The very next chapter of Genesis opens with Sarah's death. Is there perhaps a connection between the two narratives? Verse 5 of chapter 22, in verse 5, Abraham tells his servants, you stay here, the boy and I will go up there, we will worship, and we will return to you. Is this merely a way to keep Isaac in the dark? Or perhaps does Abraham have an inkling that he will not have to carry out the sacrifice? Does he somehow know that God will change the divine mind, as it were? And if so, what does that mean in terms of how we understand the trial, the test of Abraham? And then in verse 19, a very intriguing verse in the passage, Abraham returned to his servants and they went to Beersheba. Where is Isaac? Rabbinic tradition says that he went to study in a yeshiva, an academy of higher Jewish learning. Modern readers might suggest that Isaac was so traumatized by his near sacrifice that he had to spend a few years on the psychiatrist's couch. Who could blame him for not returning home with his father? So that's just some opening thoughts. I do want to share a number of clearly selected Jewish interpretations of the story of the binding of Isaac. First, and probably the most prevalent one, the narrative teaches us the deep, profound, almost inscrutable faith of the patriarch. Abraham is willing to kill his beloved son at God's behest. His love of God apparently outweighs his love of Isaac, the son of his old age, the son he's been praying for, yearning for, the son who is going to be the heir and linked to future generations, as numerous as the stars in the sky. How is that all going to happen if Isaac dies on the altar? This is the ultimate test, and Abraham apparently passes the test. Already back in the 15th century in Spain, a great Spanish commentator who had to flee Spain with the expulsion in 1492, named Isaac Arama. He has a commentary called Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. And he says that since the trial was narrated in the Torah as testimony of the living God, it is as if the trial took place in the presence of every Jew, past, present, and future. No one has failed to witness through the medium the greatness of this trial and the steadfastness of Abraham's faith, which became indelibly fixed in the hearts of all members of the human race. I'll share with you briefly a corollary of that, this view of Abraham's faithfulness in God. And that is that Abraham's test of faith, I think, highlights the demands religious faith places upon us. I would argue, Dr. Renneker, that many people today are trying to seek an easy path to spiritual wholeness and holiness. If you will, I would call it religion light. Latter-day Saints and Jews understand and appreciate that our respective faith traditions are not easy, are not light. They place serious demands upon us. A great Israeli philosopher, Yeshayahu Leibowitz, a 20th century Israeli philosopher, said, in commenting on the Akedah, not everyone is Abraham, and not everyone is put to so terrible a test as that of the Akedah. Nonetheless, the daily performance of the commandments of the mitzvot represents the motivation animating the Akedah. He concludes from such a standpoint, the question, what does religion offer to me, must be completely dismissed. The only good question a believer should ask is, what am I obligated to offer for the sake of religion? Let me pause there as the first a great commentary story.
No, that's great. I really like that. And there's some clear resonances with Latter-day Saint tradition and scripture even. So in the Doctrine and Covenants, so Joseph Smith, recording largely a collection of Joseph Smith's revelations, there's one in particular that cites Abraham having to offer up Isaac. And it's revealed to Joseph Smith in this context of the Latter-day Saints being driven out of their homes in Missouri during the winter. And so, they've just been, had to leave all of their belongings and, so risking their life to do this, having to be driven out, and, intense sufferings. And it says there, this is Doctrine and Covenants, section 101. It says there, therefore they must needs be chastened and tried, even as Abraham, who was commanded to offer up his only son. And then here's the moral lesson there. For all those who will not endure chastening, but nanai cannot be sanctified. So there's this link between, chastening, the trials that you're experiencing, and sanctification. So that choice, like you're saying, that Abraham is kind of a paradigm of faith and trust, love towards God, that there's something in that, crucible of trial that brings some sort of sanctification or holiness. Yeah.
And we have this, by the way, of a parallel in the Jewish tradition. We call it in Hebrew Yisurin Shalahava, chastisements or tests of love. This is one way that God demonstrates divine love, is by putting the faithful, by testing people. And it's not an easy concept. Not everyone accepts it today, but it is certainly a very powerful one. I would be remiss if I didn't note here the connection between the Akedah, between the story of the binding of Isaac and martyrdom, certainly in the Jewish tradition and beyond that. In medieval Europe, there were so many Jews who martyred themselves rather than to be captured by Christian crusaders and baptized. In some cases, they even killed their own children to avoid that fate for them. So this story has resonated for centuries in the Jewish tradition, and very sadly and tragically, often in cases of martyrdom, the ultimate test, if you will.
Yeah, well, that's heavy. If nothing else, right? Yeah, dear. Okay, that's right. So good. So you're the first kind of line that you're following here in Jewish tradition is Abraham's faithfulness to this kind of impossible commandment of God, and how that serves as a witness for Abraham, and kind of then as a model for the experience of any believer. Or anyone, just anyone in general, in terms of their relationship with God.
Exactly. This school of thought holds that the lesson the message of the story of the binding of Isaac is profound faith, and even following a commandment that would seem immoral and unjust and the worst possible thing to ask and order somebody to do. This demonstrates Abraham's great love of God and great devotion to God and his faith. There's a very different, I'll share, if I may, the second kind of large school of thought, which is the lesson of the binding of Isaac is not Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. Rather, it's the divine intervention that halts the deed. All right. In the key moment, the climactic moment of the narrative, an angel of God cries out to the patriarch, stop, don't do anything to the boy. Don't kill him. Don't touch him. Get your hands off the boy. Okay. All right. You can't do this. And scholars would argue, and others commentators would argue, that this is the end. Marks the end of the idolatrous practice of human sacrifice, especially the sacrifice of firstborn children. God, according to them, the point of the story is that God abhors human sacrifice. All right. Instead, God, as we know in the Torah, God mandates that the Israelites bring animal sacrifices. And not surprisingly, Moriah, the site of the binding of Isaac, becomes, in Jewish tradition, the Temple Mount, the site of the temple, the ancient temple, the holy temple in Jerusalem, where sacrifices were offered to God, not human sacrifice, animal sacrifices, other sacrifices. Okay. Shalom Spiegel, a great professor at my alma mater and the 20th century professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, a great scholar of medieval Hebrew literature, wrote a fascinating book called The Last Trial on the legends and lore of the command to Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And he writes, the Akedah story, the binding of Isaac, repels once and for all the primitive notion of the sanctity of the human firstborn and its derivative demand for the literal sacrifice of children. The Akedah story declares war on the remnant of idolatry in ancient Israel and undertook to remove root and branch the whole long, terror-laden inheritance from idolatrous generations. We know that, there were idolatrous practices that involved human sacrifice, okay, and even child sacrifice. And to these commentators, the main thrust of the story is they did that. This is an abhorrent practice. This is blasphemous. This is abhorrent in the eyes of God and man, and we don't do that anymore. And to them, the point of the story is not that Abraham was willing to carry out the sacrifice, but the notion that the sacrifice was stopped.
I like that. And I think, again, there's a strong resonance with Latter-day Saint tradition in kind of an unexpected way there about this idea of putting a stop to human sacrifice. And that's in the Latter-day Saint Book of Abraham, where this part of the first chapter of Abraham, it seems to be kind of elaborating on, or kind of a Latter-day Saint midrash, if you will, on Genesis 12, when Abraham is first commanded to leave the land of his fathers, right, in Ur of the Chaldees, and this chapter essentially records Abraham being offered as a sacrifice by the priests of that area. So he is experiencing that himself as kind of a heathen sacrifice on the receiving end. And then it takes divine intervention where God comes and stops these priests from offering him, which it wasn't just Abraham, it was part of this larger tradition of regular sacrifices, human sacrifices to these various gods. But God comes down and stops the priest from sacrificing Abraham. And so in Latter-day Saint thought, that has to inform how Latter-day Saints read Genesis 22, which is Abraham being asked essentially to do the same thing to his own son, which kind of, so it would have been one thing if Abraham hadn't experienced what it's like to be a living sacrifice on an altar, right? Still imaginable, but then having him actually experience that himself, it seems to kind of turn up the dial on the emotional dissonance that Abraham might have been experiencing there. But at the same time, could also have, like you said, kind of held open the possibility that you alluded to in Abraham's address to the servants that go with them, that we will go up and we plural, will come back down. So the fact that God intervened in Abraham's near sacrifice could have held open that possibility that his faith that God could do the same for his son, but none of that is spelled out in the text. It's just kind of left to our imagination. In this case, for me at least, is my emotional imagination is more activated there in that particular instance. So yeah, so that's really interesting.
I like it very much. It is, as you said, a great example of a Latter-day Saint midrash on the narrative, and I like it very much. And actually, kind of leads me to another school of thought, and yet a third Jewish interpretation, which I like very much, which is perhaps Abraham misunderstood the divine command. Perhaps God merely wanted the patriarch to take his son up the mountain and then take him down again. And this is based on a careful reading of the Hebrew text. Verse 2, there's a Hebrew word there which is generally translated as offer him up as a sacrifice, but the Hebrew could also be read as not offer him up, but take him up. And there's a lovely Jewish midrash which has the following conversation between Abraham and God. God says to the patriarch, "Did I tell you slaughter him? Didn't I command you to bring him up? You brought him up on the altar, and now take him down again." In other words, I told you to take him up. I saw that you were willing to do this. I take him down. I never told you to kill him. The continuation of this midrash is fascinating. According to this midrash, Abraham is very upset. He turns to God and says, "What? I came up all this way for nothing? You took me on this journey, all right? And you saying I misunderstood you? I came all this way for nothing. Can I at least draw a little blood from him? Let me do a little something here because I've come all this way. My goodness." And the angel comes down and says, don't do anything to him. Don't even let that knife touch his body, which is a fascinating commentary. In other words, why does the angel call out so many times? Because Abraham is so faithful to God that he really says, I want to prove that how I do something to the kid. And the angel says, no, don't touch him at all, which is really, and it, again, a lot of modern commentators are drawn to a similar narrative or similar midrash, if you will, interpretation, which is that, just cannot accept the fact that a loving, compassionate God would command the patriarch to do such a thing. So perhaps indeed Abraham misunderstood all along.
So in that, then, what would this kind of third line of interpretation, how might that affect then a Jewish community? So if the rabbi is focusing on that particular interpretation or in individual study there, what would that third one that maybe Abraham misunderstood exactly what God was trying to say? What are the kind of devotional or practical implications for?
I mean, first, be careful what the heavenly voices you listen to.
Right.
Make sure you get it right. It's a two-way street. It's communication, and I think this line of reasoning is probably a little more popular, shall we say, in progressive Jewish circles, which say that you can't always take things literally, and it also kind of it might. In some ways, without that second part I mentioned, it might rehabilitate Abraham a little bit, that he misunderstood, and it kind of in terms of the divine image, God looks a lot better in this account, right? Because how could a loving, compassionate God do this? So I think it's a cautionary tale, if you will. We have to be careful the commands we think we hear. Maybe we have to question parts of our own respective traditions that we think may not be totally moral in society today. That opens up a whole can of worms, if you will. But that is one way of looking at it, I think.
Yeah. So that seems, from what you said there, it seems to kind of provide a counterpoint or perhaps a counterbalance to the first line of interpretation, where Abraham is this kind of, again, this paradigm of faithfulness in God that perhaps that this latter interpretation seems to be suggesting that there are limits to that, right? That there's a blind faith or blind obedience, or that one could be too enthusiastic in some senses about acting out or fulfilling what they feel God to be doing, that there's some sort of tempering that has to happen. there. So that's that's a fascinating, I think, counterpoint to the first point that you made.
Yeah, one of my teachers, I had the privilege of hosting him at a synagogue years ago when I was rabbi, was Rabbi Pinchas Peli of blessed memory, who was a wonderful Orthodox rabbi in Israel, wrote for many years the weekly Torah columns for the Jerusalem Post, professor at Ben Gurion University, the Negev. And writing about this and other narratives, he said, God doesn't want blind obedience. God didn't create us as robots. God wants us to be thinking human beings. And of course, as you well know, in the Jewish tradition, we question most everything over and over again. It's been said often that the mark of a, if you will, of a good Jew is not getting the answers right; it's getting the questions right and asking lots of good questions and questioning even one's faith and questioning, as many commentaries do. How could God have done that? How could why is God portrayed here as a God who would command a father to kill his son? It's a difficult question, and we need to ask those questions.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point of, I think, divergence from Christian interpretations of this particular passage, including Latter-day Saint interpretations, where this then the idea of a father sacrificing an only son or a beloved son. And the sort of turmoil that's creating, but then God delivering and doing something beautiful as a result of that, increasing God's blessings or promises to the faithful. That's picked up as kind of a direct analog for God, Heavenly Father, and offering up Jesus Christ in similar imagery. So that's a link that's made in Latter-day Saint thought and other Christian thought. So in those, it would be difficult, I think, for a Christian interpreter. It might be difficult for certain corners of Christian interpretation to say that Abraham had it completely wrong because they're staking their belief on the fact that this is kind of a type or an anticipation of something that's going to happen later historically in the life of Jesus. But still, I think in spite of that, real difference in interpretive difference between Christian and Jewish community, and in that sense, that there's still something to learn from what the third option that you mentioned, that really kind of stepping back and making sure that you understand, if you really do want to understand the will of God, taking that seriously, and not, like you were saying, taking the easy route, which would be just kind of assuming that you understand everything and just kind of going full steam ahead, but really being more thoughtful, mindful of what God might be trying to say, what God might not be trying to say at the same time, and kind of weighing those more cautious faith, but still faith nonetheless, perhaps. I don't know. So I think that's something that maybe not, I don't know if Latter-day Saints would say that that's, would be even among the most important ways to take that. But I think it's definitely something that should be part of the conversation as we're discussing Abraham as a righteous exemplar for the faithful, that there can be limits to that in times when humans can act and over enthusiastically in some ways, right?
So let me throw a curveball at you, since you mentioned Christian tradition. There is I'll call it a very much a minority school of thought in Jewish tradition, which says that perhaps Isaac indeed was sacrificed on the altar and he was resurrected. We have some ancient texts beginning in the late Gaonic period and in medieval times that talk about the ashes of Isaac, to which most of us would say, ashes of Isaac? What ashes? Isaac wasn't sacrificed. The deed was stopped. Okay, and it begins actually in a midrashic text, and we find it in a number of medieval texts. I talked earlier about the martyrdom of Jews in France and Germany during the medieval period. We know that this view that Isaac really was sacrificed and resurrected brought some comfort to Jews facing martyrdom, Jews who had to kill their own children, okay, rather than having them be baptized, and Jews who had to kill themselves in order to avoid persecution and forced baptism and the like. And to them, this, again, to be really clear, this is not normative Jewish tradition here, but texts that spoke of the ashes of Isaac brought them comfort, saying, well, if we carry this out, perhaps like our ancestor Isaac, we might be resurrected. Okay. And what's the basis of this in the text? Well, we talked about earlier, verse 19, and Abraham returned to his servants and they went to Beersheba. Where the heck was Isaac? What happened to Isaac? Yes, of course, he comes up later in the Torah, but Isaac isn't mentioned there. All right. He doesn't actually, for scholars who believe that there are two interwoven schools of thought here, the E source and the J source, Isaac doesn't appear again in what scholars consider to be the one source. Okay. And again, this later Midrashic tradition developed this notion that Isaac actually had been sacrificed. Now, some commentators say this was just a metaphor. Okay. But others say texts about the ashes of Isaac and resurrection. Clearly, some people believe that he was indeed sacrificed. All right, he was killed on the altar and he was brought back to life. And to be clear to our Latter-day Saint viewers, resurrection is not just a Christian idea. Okay, 3 times a day, traditional Jews pray end the first paragraph, the first blessing of the most important prayer of the service, the Amidah. Praise to you, O Lord, Mechayeh Hamatim, literally mean who resurrects the dead. Many moderns are uncomfortable with that translation, and they translate or calls the dead to life everlasting, and or resurrects everything. They change the text, but the traditional words simply mean who brings the dead back to life. That is a Jewish notion, okay? Resurrection, and of course Christianity did a great deal with that. So it's a fascinating text, and it's worth mentioning because it certainly speaks, I think, to your interpretations of the Akedah.
Yeah, and that is fascinating. It reminds me of a passage in the Epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, where there's a list of all these faithful individuals. It was through faith that so and so did such and such, and there's kind of going through the Hebrew Bible, a number of figures, and when it gets to Abraham, it says that, by faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, right? So he had received this promise, and it said that he offered him up, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure, and that figure being of Jesus. So here, it doesn't necessarily say that he was actually offered up as a sacrifice, but at the very, you could read that into that possibility, but I think it's more the more likely reading there is that Abraham believed that even if he had to go through with the sacrifice, that God could resurrect him, that was a possibility, and because of that, he was willing. That's why he was willing to commit all the way to offering Isaac as a sacrifice. So so that's an interesting kind of overlap in thought there.
Yeah, and I would want to credit, I mentioned him earlier, Professor Spiegel, professor of medieval Hebrew literature. His book really, even though I quoted him earlier on another subject, his book really focused, he kind of, if you will, forgive the pun, resurrected some of these piyutim, some of these poems and other texts that speak about the ashes of Isaac, and brought them to life essentially in the 20th century for the Jewish readers and scholars to note that there was this minority view that Isaac really had been sacrificed and was brought back from the dead. If I may, let me share with you just one or two others before we take, I see a lot of questions already in the chat. Who is the hero of this story? Who is the hero of the narrative? Many people would say, probably conventional interpretation in the Jewish tradition is that it was Abraham, right, willing to sacrifice his son. Others would argue that Isaac was the real hero, that especially if he was 37 years old, he was willing to be sacrificed, didn't protest. Yehuda Amichai, one of the great Israeli poets of the 20th century, had a poem which says the following: "The real hero of the Isaac story was the ram, who didn't know about the conspiracy between the others, as if he had volunteered to die instead of Isaac. I want to sing a song in his memory about his curly wool and his human eyes, about the horns that were silent on his living head, and how they made those horns into shofars, ram's horns, when he was slaughtered, to sound their battle cries or to blur out their obscene joy. The angel went home. Isaac went home. Abraham and God had gone long before. But the real hero of the Isaac story was the ram." What an interesting poem. Israeli poets and authors spent a lot of time writing and speaking about the Akedah. It's such a powerful story in so many ways. And I thought it's just a fascinating poem. And again, I would be remiss if I didn't note that the connection between the ram that appears miraculously and caught in the thicket and the ram's horn, the shofar, which is the preeminent symbol of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And throughout the Jewish liturgy of the Holy Day period, High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, there are repeated references to the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice. And one of the reasons for blowing the shofar is indeed to recall the binding of Isaac and his near sacrifice on the mountain. And lastly, and I know you and I have studied him before together, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the just greatest 20th century Jewish theologians, philosophers. I taught at my seminary for many years, although sadly he passed away before I entered rabbinical school. He asked the question, what if the angel sent by God had not arrived in time? And he tells the following story. He actually, Rabbi Heschel was a great champion of civil rights, also was somebody who very much opposed the war in Vietnam. And in a book he co-published with two other scholars called called The Vietnam Crisis of Conscience, he told the following story. He was a child of 7 reading this chapter of the Bible, which tells of the sacrifice of Isaac. Tells the story, Isaac was on the way to Mount Moriah with his father. Then he lay down on the altar, bound, waiting to be sacrificed. He said, my heart began to beat even faster. It actually sobbed with pity for Isaac. Behold, Abraham now lifted the knife, and now my heart froze within me with fright. Suddenly the voice of the angel was heard, Abraham, lay not thine hand upon the lad, for now I know that thou fearest God. And here I broke out in tears, and I wept aloud. Why are you crying? Asked the rabbi. You know that Isaac was not killed. And I said to him, still weeping, but Rabbi, supposing the angel had come a second too late? The rabbi comforted me and calmed me by telling me that an angel cannot come too late. Rabbi Heschel concludes, an angel cannot be late, but man made of flesh and blood may be. Rabbi Heschel was one who took his teachings, his work, his PhD work on the prophets, left the hallowed halls of 3080 Broadway of the seminary, the ivory tower, if you will, and passionately believed in working for the betterment of all humanity. What we call in the Jewish tradition is, tikkun olam, repairing, healing a broken world. And his point was that, God is not going to be late. An angel of God isn't going to be late, but we as human beings so often are too late in intervening to right the wrongs of the world around us.
Yeah, that's another really powerful example there of how these questions can resonate in different ways, and I think really profound ways. Yeah, so that's, Rabbi Heschel was something else in the best possible use of that phrase. Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, both of those with us. Huygen was the name of the poet.
Yehuda Amichai. And if you like, for those who are joining us and those who will watch the podcast later, the video later, I could send you a list of I can send you a sheet of some of the sources if you want to post it on your website.
Great, excellent. Yes, we would very much like that. Good. Okay, any other last things that you wanted to make sure and get in there before we get to some really good questions?
We're about 20 minutes before the hour. Let's go to the queue.
Okay, great. Okay, so again, to our audience, For those who might have joined after the top of the hour, you have an opportunity to submit your questions here. There's a good sized list of excellent questions that have already been submitted, but you can continue to add to that if you'd like. And you just do that at the bottom of your screen. So we have several questions about different perspectives from this story. One of which is Sarah. Do we have anything in Jewish tradition that you've come across that talks about Sarah's perspective from this whole experience?
Yes, there are a number of midrashim, thank goodness, that bring her into the story. Some that have her sort of wondering what's going on here. Abraham, where are you going and what are you doing? And the very powerful one, as I mentioned earlier, the very next chapter of Genesis, which in the Jewish lectionary cycle begins the next week's Torah reading, talks about Sarah's death. And according to one school of thought, one set of midrashic interpretation, Sarah is waiting at the door of the tent when Abraham returns without Isaac. Again, this verse that says, Abraham goes back to his servants, they go to Beersheba, Isaac is not mentioned. And upon seeing her husband and the servants there without her beloved son, she dies on the spot. She dies on the spot. And that is, such a powerful interpretation that she believed that Isaac had been sacrificed, that Abraham had carried out the deed. And she, this is a son of her old age. This is her dream. This is her link to future generations. And I think it's an incredibly poignant and important way of bringing her back into the story.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of reading this passage in context, right? So if you're stopping with the traditional, these modern demarcations of verses and chapters, you stop at the end of 22 and they've gone off to their place. And then at the beginning of 23, that's when Sarah dies. But that is not a necessary break. You just kind of keep reading that, then you kind of have to tie, okay, this death happened just after this particular event. Is there some sort of connection there? So that's, I think that's it's really interesting, I think important reading that involves Sarah. Of course, there's nothing in the text specifically that says what Sarah might have said, or, all we have is that Abraham leaves very early in the morning. And so we don't know if that was to avoid Sarah, if that was, to beat the heat, if, what sort of role Sarah played prior to Abraham leaving. We're just left to kind of fill in all of those blanks ourselves. But certainly when it does specifically mention her there at the beginning of 23, we have to take that into account.
She is 127 years old, so that's not bad.
So
but again, not a bad life. But again, the fact that it comes right after this narrative is powerful. And again, we should mention that the narrative that comes before, which is in traditional synagogues, is the reading read on the first day, is the birth of Isaac. You get Abraham and Sarah, not spring chickens, right? They're well up there in age. And the fact that she's been waiting and God remembers that she so wants a child and is unable to conceive it, but she does have a child finally. And and then of course she becomes, I didn't mention this, but of course that the previous chapter talks about how she then orders, tells Abraham, banish Ishmael, truly his firstborn son, through his maidservant. And that's a whole nother narrative. And the fact that both of them are read on Rosh Hashanah, one on the first day in traditional synagogues, this passage, the Akedah, on the second day, is also filled with all kinds of interpretations as to why we do that. They're both very powerful. They're both very troubling narratives, actually.
Interesting. So looking again here at the questions, there's one that also mentions, in addition to Sarah, we have Ishmael. Is there traditions of where Ishmael is here in the story? What role that might have played?
Well, Ishmael is not directly in this narrative. He is very much in the previous chapter. Again, he and his mother Hagar have been expelled by Abraham, and God remembers, just as God remembers, hears the cries of mother and child, and he winds up going off to wandering off, if you will, and he'll become a great nation as well. But he's not part of 22. Actually, Ishmael does not reappear, very interesting enough, until Abraham's death. And then the only time we hear Isaac and Ishmael reuniting is to bury their father. Also a very poignant moment in scripture, that the two who have been apart, who have been rivals in many ways, right, come back together. I should also mention, of course, that in Islamic tradition, it is Ishmael who is the subject of the near sacrifice, not Isaac. So Ishmael, is very important in that tradition. But he's not directly in chapter 22. He's off wherever he is with his mom, and or actually he's already married, perhaps. God protects him, and he becomes the father of a different nation.
Yeah, great. So again, kind of rounding this out from different perspectives within the story itself of characters that are or are not present there. Isaac, right? So several questions here about Isaac. So maybe in general, are there different commentaries that you can recall that speak about Isaac's perspective from this? Anything that Isaac thought or said, or reaction to anything from the very leaving the tent in the morning to the sacrifice itself from his perspective?
Well, there's pretty much silence here from Isaac in the first part of the story, until in verse 7, Isaac said to Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here's the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham says, "God will see to the sheep." And a very haunting phrase, we have it twice in the narrative, the two of them walk on together. Imagine father and son walking together. Isaac just asked the critical question, right? Dad, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will take care of this. God will see to the sheep. Now, again, some would argue that already Abraham has got a sense that he's not going to have to carry out this deed. But Isaac is pretty much silent for the narrative. Again, he doesn't show up right afterwards. Then we have the story of finding a wife for Isaac, right? And Isaac, it's interesting. Isaac in the Jewish tradition, many people would see Isaac as kind of a transitional character. He didn't do a whole lot. He's not like his father Abraham. He's not, the forefather of a nation. He's not like Jacob, right? Okay, my Hebrew name happens to be Yaakov Yisrael, Jacob Israel. So I get both sides of that, and you would have part of it as well. Isaac is kind of a transitional figure, but many commentators have risen to his defense, saying, "Look, he did a few good things. He was certainly the bridge between Abraham and future generations, and that we shouldn't take that lightly. He does a few things. He reopens wells that his father had dug that had been closed by the Philistines. He does a few good things. But then, of course, Isaac in his later years, Isaac is tricked, right, by Jacob. So some would say, this all comes back to haunt him. But in the narrative itself, certainly a close reading of the Bible is that other than that, he says very little. He willingly walks together with his father to the mountain. But again, there's midrash that fills it in, that some would say he goes to study afterwards. No matter how you read the text, we can only begin to speculate how traumatized he must have been by this experience, whatever age he was, right?
Yeah. Oh, so and when you mentioned the age, you mentioned 37 being one possible age for Isaac at the time. Where does that come from? Do you know how that is calculated?
Yeah, I don't recall the details, but that's a midrash based on rabbis calculating ages and whatever. And some would say he was much younger, but some would say he was like bar mitzvah age, 13. But even a 13-year-old you would think would question, "Hey, Dad, what's going on here?" And does he have a premonition of what's happening here? He's looking for the sacrificial animal. It doesn't happen till later. He apparently willingly lays down upon the altar. So it's a mystery. And that's why some would say that perhaps Isaac is the hero of the story, not Abraham. That Isaac goes along with this. Whatever age he was, he is willing to be sacrificed to honor God, to fulfill God's command. And that's a very powerful thing as well. So that's kind of taking that idea of faith and obedience to God kind of to a different level, whereas Abraham says, that God speaks to Abraham,
we don't have record in this chapter of God speaking to Isaac and saying the same thing to Isaac. All we have is Isaac obeying his father on what he's going to do. And at least from what we have that's actually put in the text, we don't have Abraham explaining to Isaac what's going to be happening. The only thing we have is saying that, God will provide. When Isaac asks, okay, we have the fire and the knife and the wood and everything else. The only thing we're missing is the lamb.
Exactly.
Right.
And I should say that in fairness to Abraham, there's an interesting midrash interpretation on chapter 22, verse 2. God says, take your son, your favorite one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. There's a midrash that, again, imagines this conversation between Abraham and God. God says, take your son. And according to the midrash, Abraham says, well, God, I have two sons. He said, your favorite one. And Abraham responds, well, this one is the favorite of his mother. The other one is the favorite of his mother. All right. And then he finally says, whom you love. It says, I love them both. And then he says, finally, Isaac. In other words, stop playing with me. I like that midrash because it seems to indicate that Abraham wasn't totally willing to go ahead with this. It wasn't just blind obedience. There was some questioning going on that Abraham, there was some hesitation here. Okay. He didn't really necessarily want to carry this out without, God explaining it to him fully.
Yeah. That is interesting. Yeah. In the text, you have this series of, take your son, your only son, the one that you love, and then specifically says Isaac after that, as if, that there's kind of pauses, waiting for a response or, it does seem that there's at least space for that sort of interpretation that Abraham might not have just completely, once God said do this, that he just kind of runs and does it, but that he's thinking it through to some extent that requires greater clarification by God.
And by the way, the poetry of the poetic almost tone of the Hebrew is, I'll just share the Hebrew of that. Kachna et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et yitzchak. The repetition, it just flows so nicely in the Hebrew, and it's the basis of this midrash I just shared with you.
Yeah, it's great. So there's a few questions here about maybe asking for maybe a little bit clarification or explanation about the medieval Jews who killed their own family members, who killed themselves, right, as martyrs, or offered their children as martyrs to avoid, forced conversion forced baptism by Christians. In terms of the understanding, so what lay behind those sorts of actions, especially in relation to this particular passage? So somebody who recognized the second of the three kind of primary interpretations, the second one that this was kind of a polemic against human sacrifice, right? Saying that human sacrifice is not appropriate. God does not sanction that and will not ever sanction that. Tying that interpretation to the seeming contradiction of Jews offering themselves as sacrifices, as human sacrifices, or family members. So how do those relate to each other? How do they contradict? If you can just kind of help us understand that a little bit better.
Sure, and I'll just share a brief overview because it's an important but complicated and complex topic. In medieval period, when Jews faced terrible persecution, pogroms, accused of poisoning wells, accused of taking Christian children and using their blood for matzah, ritual murder charges, and the like, host desecration. These were horrible charges, and particularly during the Crusades, when the Crusaders, on their way to quote unquote liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidels, in their view, they were marching through Europe and came upon Jewish communities and said, well, we're going on to the Holy Land to liberate our holy city, but we got a whole bunch of infidels in our midst here, right? All these Jewish people in Europe. And so in the Rhineland and other communities, there were so many cases of the Crusaders and the mobs attacking Jewish communities, sometimes locking Jews in their synagogues and setting fire to the synagogue, everybody, dying inside. And in some cases, in many cases actually, offering Jews the choice, either agree to convert to Christianity or die. And in a significant number of those cases, again, understanding that human life is sacred, many Jews found that their choice, their choice in their view, was to die as a martyr to their faith, proclaiming the words of the Jewish proclamation of faith, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So you had many cases of Jews killing themselves in order to avoid, certain either death or conversion at the hands of the invaders, of the Crusaders. And in some cases, again, saying that horrible as it is, we would rather have our children die as Jews than suffer under, oppression and persecution and likely, et cetera. And so it's like the ultimate horrible choice. If Abraham's test was horrible and the ultimate test, this was the ultimate test that in real life that families faced, that parents faced, facing persecution in Europe. And again, the comfort of the story perhaps was if they, and this is where I think Shalom Spiegel actually found the text, where these medieval liturgical references to the ashes of Isaac. What the heck are they doing there? Again, what would bring a small measure of solace to these people? Well, if God could resurrect Isaac, God perhaps could resurrect them, and God could resurrect their own children. All right, better to die as a martyr to your faith, and in hopes that perhaps indeed there will be a resurrection. So this is, I hope that explains that. I mean, it's a horrible period in history, and I would just add, I don't want to get too contemporary here, but we're a little over a week after the hostage situation in a synagogue in Texas, and tragically anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head once again. And thank God that had a positive outcome, right? The rabbi and the other hostages were freed, but their anti-Semitism is alive and well, and we have to recognize so many forms of oppression and persecution. I've written, one of the first articles I wrote that before we even began our dialogue was an article with my friend and colleague, Professor Stephen Windmuller, about what Jews can learn from Latter-day Saints. And one of the things we talked about is that Jews and Latter-day Saints share a parallel history of persecution and suffering for our faith. And also, thank God, a redemption, an exodus to a promised land, and then redemption in that promised land. And that's important to keep in mind. That's I believe one of the strong parallels, one of the themes we share in common as Jews and Latter-day Saints.
So I think there's two more questions here. One of them, I think an excellent one. What have you, in your experience with discussing this with other Christians in your interfaith and ecumenical experiences, what have been some of the most challenging parts of reading this with Christians that you've experienced? Have you had enough experience to times where you've actually sit down and read this together or talked about this particular passage that have been challenging?
Not recently, but we've had these discussions. I've had them with Muslims as well, by the way. And again, the parallel passages and where there was the near sacrifice of Ishmael or Isaac. I think one of the differences perhaps you alluded to earlier, Dr. Renneker, which is, that this resonates so clearly in Christian tradition as the ultimate act of faith and, resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? And Jews, while resurrection is, as we've said, a minority view in Jewish tradition, it was not a tradition that was well known to most Jews, most Jewish people, most Jewish commentators. It simply didn't enter the mainstream of Jewish thought. And so that probably is the key difference. We have very different views of how we read passages of scripture. And this is probably one of those passages where we and I think probably the other piece, and we also alluded to it earlier, is that, Jews in dialogue and Jews in learning and relearning this passage over and over again, at least twice a year, right? In synagogue, are very comfortable with lots of questions, questioning faith, questioning, did Abraham misunderstand God's command? And that's not always the case for our Christian friends and colleagues when they read the passage. Our tradition is very much a tradition of questioning.
Yeah, that's good. That's very good. Last question here. And this one's kind of maybe more personal. So from this particular story, so as a rabbi, you've taught sermons on this, probably different, several different iterations of this, while you're, a pulpit rabbi. So what, at this point now in your life as being as well seasoned as you are, having gone through what you have, what is kind of the takeaway right now at this moment in your life? What is kind of the takeaway devotionally that you kind of take in a positive way, that this story speaks to you now?
Wow, what an excellent question. Trying to think back to 30 plus years of sermons on this, and I don't have them all on file. I would say but it's a great question. At this moment in time, I would probably resonate with the last commentary I shared of Rabbi Heschel, that is a powerful view we have in Jewish tradition. I believe in Christian tradition as well. In the Hebrew, it says, Adam shutafo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Human beings are God's partners in the act of taking care of the creation of the world. That we have a role to play with God in making this world a better place and in healing the many, many wounds of our society. And that's why I resonate so much with Rabbi Heschel, who took his vision of the prophets, his teachings, his learning. He was a profound theologian and got out of the seminary and fought for civil rights and fought for what he believed in, and was a champion of interfaith dialogue long before anybody was talking about interfaith dialogue. I teach my students at Loyola Marymount University that Los Angeles looks the city of angels looks very angelic when you're flying in a couple thousand feet over the city. When you land and get to ground level in LA or almost any other city, Salt Lake City, it doesn't matter. There are so many problems we face in our society, right? There's hunger, homelessness, poverty, people who don't have access to healthcare, problems that seem to be exacerbated now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And angels of God will come on time, but the real question for us is, will we be there on time? Will we work together as people of faith to address the gnawing problems in our society and make this world a better place for all?
Oh, wonderful. I think you can add that to your file of sermons over the past 30 years. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. And inspiring. I think that is important. And then we got somebody, certainly a lesson that Latter-day Saints can take to heart, that idea of the participatory nature of our lives in God's life and what we can do together actively to make the world better. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for spending this evening with us. Appreciate it. And everything that you've been doing in terms of interfaith dialogue with different communities, including and especially the Latter-day Saint community here. So this is, we're at the little past the top of the hour. Thanks for sticking with us, folks. Sorry we weren't able to get to more of your questions. They were excellent, but we appreciate you for tuning in. And we'd again like to thank you for joining us this evening for one of these regular events that we're going to be holding every month on the fourth Sunday of each month. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, you can rewatch this event or listen to a podcast version of this by going to www.widtsoefoundation.org. And the Widtsoe Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit, which means we are entirely funded by our generous audience members. So if you found what we talked about tonight and what we're doing here valuable, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at widtsoefoundation.org/donate. But that's enough of that for this evening. Again, I'd like to thank Rabbi Diamond for joining us for our next conversation, February 27th. We're going to discuss Joseph in Egypt with Rabbi Annie Tucker, who is the senior rabbi at Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York. So please join us for that. Thanks again, Rabbi Diamond. Hope to speak with you soon. And to everyone watching, good night.